It was almost a massacre. Out of the blue, a former mental patient walked through a department store cutting women's throats.
Just walking around with a knife in his hand, going past people, slitting their throats. And it was really awful.
But were vital warnings overlooked?
At the moment, I don't understand why I'm sat here with a 5-inch slash down my throat.
They could not have predicted what he was about to do. I'm absolutely sure of it.
December the 8th, 1994. There were 15 shopping days to Christmas when a man with a history of mental illness walked calmly into Rackhams, Birmingham's top department store. He had a knife in each hand.
He went up to the next counter, slashed the sales assistant straight across the throat. I went over to her, held her throat. He walked over to the lifts and slashed what looked like a customer. He then carried on walking around the store.
Last Friday, 32-year-old David Cedric Morgan received 10 life sentences for wounding. For his victims, it was an important moment.
Can we just get your reaction to the outcome?
I'm happy with it. Happy with what's happened here. It's just sad that it took so long to get there.
But it's far from the end of their story.
Since it happened.
Sad. It's changed our lives completely.
So I don't feel that justice has been done to him or for the public, and we must take note, because these events are happening over and over again, and these mistakes are leading to death.
One door has closed, he's gone down, but it still remains. Questions have still got to be answered as to why he was out to do what he did.
World in Action has obtained confidential medical records on their attacker. Tonight we tell the story of a lonely, disturbed young man who tried to become a mass murderer. A man whose isolation and inadequacy fueled a hatred of women that he couldn't control. A story of warnings and signals which went out over 6 years, but were consistently missed. And how it all built up to 3 minutes of carnage in a select department store.
I was on my first coffee break of the morning, and as you can appreciate, there's rather a lot of staff in the building at that time, and the canteen was humming quite nicely, and I just heard the screams over the radio.
All of a sudden it just went into like a panic mode. There was people shouting over each other. There was, I couldn't really understand what was going on because of people shouting it over each other on the radio and things like that. But by the sound of it, it was urgent.
I saw a man pick up his child and run, and the next thing I saw was David Morgan walking very calmly, very slowly towards me.
David Morgan was a loner. He comes from a large family, but he lived on his own and had few friends. His childhood had been very ordinary, but since leaving school, he'd found it impossible to get a job.
You said to me, been on these job schemes, and I thought I would get a job after. And then at the end of the day, you know, you've been for hundreds of jobs and nobody wanted to know.
But he also found it hard to get on with women.
I never see a girlfriend. I never see David with a girlfriend.
David Morgan had never had a girlfriend. He became convinced women just ignored him, and it made him more and more angry. The turning point came in 1987, when his father died after a long, distressing illness.
I think that's the time when he started, you know, going a bit funny, when his father died. His father's son, you know, they're always with each other. And I think he was so upset that he couldn't go to the funeral.
Psychiatrists believed that was when Morgan's mental disintegration began.
I heard a shout. Someone shouted my name. It was Dave Willett's colleague I used to work with. Because I recognised it as Dave's voice, I turned around to look where it had come from. And as I turned, for a split second, I saw a black man. at the corner of my eye.
I saw a friend of mine, Karen Crosby, sat at the table on the Clinique counter, and all down the side of her blouse there was all red blood, and it was then that I noticed the old lady on the floor and absolutely spark out, and my first thought was, oh my God, she's dead. So I reassured Karen, went over to the old lady, bent over her, checked that she was breathing fine, leave her where she is, she's safe where she is. Stood up, and there he was, 2 inches away from my face.
David Morgan began attacking women in 1987, the year his father died.
He'd attacked a woman in a shop. He'd grabbed her and pushed her over and walked out the shop and walked into a police station. He was dealt with by the magistrates' courts. He was then remanded to prison, where quite clearly he was mentally ill, and then transferred to All Saints Hospital.
Morgan spent 5 months in All Saints Mental Hospital being treated for schizophrenia.
He was on medication while he was in hospital. Slowly the medication was reduced while he was living in the community. He responded well, there was no psychiatric symptoms. Eventually medication was stopped. There continued to be no psychiatric symptoms, and he appeared to make a full recovery. And that was the last contact we had with him in September of 1988.
For the first time, a crucial warning had been missed. While he was being treated, a social work assistant wrote up in Morgan's file her worries about how he might behave when he was released.
I personally believe that he may end up harming someone female, but I think the only way we can prevent this is by giving David plenty of support. However, it is doubtful if we could offer him 24-hour support at this stage.
She was right. 3 months later, when David Morgan was released from the hospital, his social services file was closed with the letters NFA. No further action. Birmingham Social Services told World in Action that the social worker's fears were
the opinion of an unqualified person which was not confirmed by subsequent medical diagnosis.
For the next 6 years, Morgan drifted out of contact with the mental health services and increasingly out of control. He'd moved out of his mother's house and into a council tower block where he lived alone. It was a lonely and unhappy young man who mooched around in his flat day in, day out. Few friends, no girlfriends. He was still plagued by strong, violent feelings towards women, which occasionally overwhelmed him.
David appears to have had a series of minor skirmishes with the law. Took to wandering the streets. He has been arrested for kicking women in the street, general jostling them around car parks and shopping centres, which resulted in convictions.
But no one made the connection between these arrests and his previous history. Neither the courts nor the police referred him back to the doctors. Once more, vital warnings were being missed.
On one occasion we know that David left his flat with a hammer and a knife, and the intention was to go onto the streets and injure women.
And in 1993, police threw him out of a department store for causing trouble. It was Rackhams. Again he slipped through the net, just as he would a year later.
An arm came from behind me, and then I felt like pressure on my throat. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't like I'd cut myself in the kitchen sharp. It wasn't like that at all. It was blunt. It felt like a stick. And then I put my hand up to my throat and looked at my fingers, and there was blood. And then I just ran back down the stairs.
When he came right close to me, he punched me on my left shoulder so that my head flew back, and as my head went back, he cut my throat and disappeared across my left shoulder. I slumped behind the counter in my daughter's arms and asked the lady behind the counter to phone for an ambulance quickly. She started to phone for an ambulance, and I heard my daughter Samantha say, put the phone down quickly, he's coming back.
Just 2 months before the Rackhams attack, David Morgan delivered the strongest warning yet that he was dangerous. He turned up at his GP's surgery saying he wanted to be classed as mentally ill to get invalidity benefit. And he talked of his urges to attack women. The GP was worried.
The GP saw, or he told him that he'd had a previous psychiatric admission and phoned over to the community mental health team. One of our best psychiatric nurses was on duty at the time he received the call and went over to see him straight away.
The community psychiatric nurse, or CPN, interviewed Morgan immediately.
The CPN, to his credit, talked through his feelings, his mental state. He would look for a number of things. He'd look for depression, he'd look for suicidal ideas, he'd look for anger, he'd look at experienced voices or hallucinating, and there was none of that.
But something did trouble the CPN greatly. When he wrote up his notes of the meeting, he recorded that Morgan
discussed worrying episodes of physical attacks on women in the street, although he says he can control these urges.
The nurse's conclusion could not have been clearer. He wrote that Morgan
has had, and probably still has, strong urges to attack women unprovoked.
The CPN was so concerned he arranged for Morgan to see a consultant psychiatrist 3 days later. They visited him at his flat and spoke to him at length. They did 2 things. They fixed up a meeting with the Citizens Advice Bureau to sort out his benefits, and they arranged to see him as an outpatient 2 weeks later.
They concluded, after painstaking investigation of the facts at that time, that he was not suffering from the kind of mental illness that he had presented to the services with several years earlier. And they, in that sense, the decision that they took is the same decision that 99% of psychiatrists and CPNs would take in similar situations.
The consultant and the nurse spent considerable time with him about these urges, and they weren't serious urges in that sense. They weren't life-threatening in the way they became. They just weren't. And based on the evidence that they had, they acted appropriately.
If a patient says that he's been attacking people in the street, but the nature of these attacks is relatively trivial, he's been punching, kicking, shoving people, how concerned should the doctor be that that person is a danger to the public?
The first part of the story depends on how well the doctor knows the patient and how far he is aware and has been aware, by knowing the patient over a period of time, how seriously to take this. So we're talking about the extent to which the doctor is familiar with the case. If he's unfamiliar with the case and the patient admits to having actively attacked people, then that has to be taken seriously. There's no question of that.
But the last chance to avert a tragedy had been lost, despite his previous record, and despite what he told the nurse only 3 days earlier. It was decided that David Cedric Morgan was not a danger to the public.
I just remember focusing in on his eyes, and he pulled my head back, and I didn't see a blade, I didn't see anything, I just saw his eyes and that he was smiling, and I just felt this thing I can only describe like a stick going down my chin and my neck. I had no idea at the time what he'd done. It was just all so quick, and I was pushed to one side and he carried on walking. I didn't even look behind me. I just stood there and I put my hand up to my throat, and I felt the blood come through my fingers, and I thought, oh Christ, he's got me.
When he came back, I knew that he wanted to kill me, and I was very submissive at that time, very calm, very gentle. I don't think I would have put my hand up to stop him. I wanted it to be me. The main thing was that it was me and not Samantha.
And what stopped him coming back?
A woman screamed behind him, a very piercing scream, and he swung round and carried on with his business.
David Morgan never turned up for the outpatient's appointment which had been arranged for him by the consultant and the nurse. And because it had been decided that he was not a threat, he wasn't chased up with the urgency that cases like this might require.
I think if you're concerned about somebody, perhaps because of their past history, but they're not clearly mentally ill when you see them, then in those circumstances you're not in a position to admit them to hospital, certainly not to admit them compulsorily under the Mental Health Act. Your option then, I think, is to follow them up as an outpatient, probably as a team, not just a doctor, but a team of doctor, community nurse, social worker, others, and to follow them up fairly vigorously in order to reassure yourself that they're not becoming mentally ill, and to reassure yourself that there isn't a serious risk of violence occurring.
But the medical files reveal that after he missed the appointment, it was 3 weeks before anyone went to Morgan's flat to re-establish contact. He wasn't at home. And it wasn't until December the 6th, another month later, that a date was fixed to visit him again. That visit never took place, because 2 days later, he walked into Rackhams with his knives.
People may find it peculiar, to say the least, that a man can present himself who has a history of mental illness, even if he's not showing symptoms at this time. A history of a mental illness which involved an attack on a woman. And now he is saying, I have been attacking women and I have urges to attack women. And that problem is not specifically addressed with any sense of urgency. People will find that hard to accept, I feel.
I'm disagreeing with your suggestion that it was not addressed with a sense of urgency. It was addressed appropriately at the time. In retrospect, one can say that was insufficient, given what happened with David Morgan. But that is with hindsight, and one learns from that.
I was in a shop in Great Western Arcade, which is almost opposite Rackhams. I'm a scenes of crime officer of the West Midlands Police, and I was dealing with a burglary. We got the message that people had been attacked by a man going berserk with a knife. So we went into Rackhams to look for him, obviously to get him. And we saw this chap. I saw a head and shoulders because he was standing behind a display, and that's him. So we just piled in. It's very lucky that Jim and I were literally 30 yards, I think, from the front of Rackhams. Had he carried on or got out onto the street, I'd dread to think what could have happened.
According to the doctor at the hospital, he said to me that if I hadn't been as big as I am, and I hadn't had as much fatty tissue around my throat, that actually protected the vein from the knife, I would be dead.
I had quite a good cut across my throat that has needed further plastic surgery. I think it was quite a severe scar. I was cut right across the throat.
And how close do you think you came to death that morning?
Well, as you can see, 1/2 centimetre maybe.
Morgan was taken to a nearby police station, and that night he was interviewed by police officers. This is a video recording of that interview.
Thursday, the 8th of December 1994. Will you give us your full name, please?
David Cedric Morgan.
And what's your date of birth, Dave?
4th of the 5th.
Throughout, Morgan took his solicitor's advice and said nothing.
We'd like to know why it was only women. We'd like to know why it was only white women. No comment. We'd like to know.
But in the same police station, he was also interviewed by a psychiatrist from All Saints, and with him, Morgan was much more forthcoming. World in Action has obtained the notes of this remarkable interview. He told them he'd gone to Rackhams because...
You kill a better class of people there, I suppose.
Then, told that none of his victims had died, he said,
Bloody hell, some serial killer I am. Knew I'd used the wrong side of the bloody knife. Any chance of them dying? They all hate me anyway. Now they've got a reason. That makes me feel all right now.
And he made a chilling confession. He'd originally planned to attack girls at a local grammar school. But it wasn't just the police who had questions. The Northern Birmingham Mental Health Trust held its own inquiry to see if more should have been done for Morgan 2 months earlier.
They said that the assessment was accurate, that the care plan was appropriate, that they'd acted professionally, that they'd acted commendably promptly, and that on the basis of the evidence in front of them, there was no possibility of admitting him to hospital compulsorily, nor placing him under special supervision.
The Mental Health Trust even issued a public statement. It said,
"Staff involved acted in a most professional manner and responded promptly. On the basis of information available to them, they formed an appropriate opinion and arranged the appropriate aftercare."
That statement was the first time that I realised that something was radically wrong. I saw that on the news that night. It was such a blank statement, and it was an empty statement.
Obviously they're quite satisfied to shut the files on him. But I'm not. I want to know why they came to that conclusion.
To have a man who has had psychiatric care, who has been caught before hurting women, to have a man sitting with a psychiatrist saying, "I feel violent towards white women," I think that goes beyond warning bells. I think that that psychiatrist ought to have heard the screeching of the bells in Rackhams and the screeching of the ambulance.
As David Morgan prepared to make his journey to Rackhams, even he didn't know how many warnings had gone unheeded. 6 years earlier, a social worker had warned he could be dangerous. Even when he was in court for street attacks on women, the penny didn't drop. Only 2 months earlier, he told doctors he had urges to attack women, and he'd been attacking women. But the danger had been missed. In 1987, Morgan's violence was due to a mental illness. His attack on women in Rackhams had a different cause. The latest psychiatric reports now say he's a psychopath. He has a severe personality disorder which can't be treated. So when he was sentenced last week, he was sent not to a mental hospital, but to a prison. The doctors now say this about David Morgan.
Mr. Morgan remains an extremely dangerous man. Were he at liberty, he would no doubt prove a grave and immediate danger to the public. And even in conditions of maximum security, he poses a risk to those around him.
It's already happened. Just before the anniversary of the Rackhams attacks, David Morgan cut the throat of a male nurse. David Morgan never spoke at his trial, so no one had the chance to ask him why he did what he did. This is his voice, recorded in prison.
It felt strange. It's like I was out of control. Just had to do it. I didn't want to do it, but I had to do it. This was like over years, this build-up. I didn't want to hurt. It's like once it started, I just couldn't stop. Feeling just like you were getting your own back on women. It's like women hurted me by ignoring me, so it's just like getting your own back on them. There was lots of chances for everybody to help me. I thought everybody could see that I needed help.
The public should know what went wrong. Internal investigations means that somebody's gone along and thought, oh yeah, you know, this was done, that was done. All right, we'll leave it at that. That's not enough. The public need to know what went wrong and why it went wrong.
I wish to have a public inquiry. I think the public, and I am a member of the public, should know exactly what happened, what went wrong, why it went wrong. And when we have the answers to those questions, hopefully soon we can stop these things from going wrong.
I need to know. I need to be able to understand why this happened before I can start to come to terms with it. Because at the moment I don't understand why I'm sat here with a 5-inch slash down my throat. Why? Why me? Why women?